So we have come to the last session here in plenary today. And I think that it is no coincidence that we are now going to discuss partnerships. I remember in Rio back in 2015 when the Sustainable Development Goals were being negotiated and adopted, there was a lot of discussion about which targets and should any one of them be overarching others, and as you can imagine. But there was no discussion that partnerships had to be SDG number 17, because that's a key to success, as no single actor can manage or maneuver the complexity we are faced with alone. So it's public-private partnerships, it's partnerships across silos and sectors, across different policy levels. So the need becomes evident if you look at the manifold challenges in the modern megacity. Mega problems, inequality is on the rise, climate change is deteriorating, we have fragmented governance structures. So how can cross-sectoral partnerships contribute to handle these challenges? How to get to a more holistic approach? That's what we're going to discuss now. And we will get two different takes, a business perspective and a perspective from an organization, from the city's perspective. And I just have to say to those of you who studied the program carefully before you left home, unfortunately for this session, we have had two cancellations. But we have a very, very good replacement there, because Mark Watts from the C40, the executive director, has volunteered to step in. And Mark Watts, please come to the stage together with Jim Hagemann Snabe. We are very pleased to see both of you. Please welcome these gentlemen. As I said, Mark Watts, since 2014, the executive director of C40, the Network for Cities. You're not an architect, but I read in your CV that you have been working with Europe some time back, so it's not a totally unfamiliar sector to you to work with the built environment. Thank you very much for being with us here. And Jim Hagemann Snabe has 25 years experience from some of Europe's, I could also say the world's biggest companies. SAP, chairman of the board of Maersk, the big shipping conglomerate, now chairman of Siemens, also another big European conglomerate, and you also will be on the board of World Economic Forum and have been so for a number of years. And recently, actually, I see that you have become a minority owner in Urban Partners. I'm sure that we will hear more about that, but I understand that that is also the build sector and try to help SMVs to address the whole value chain. And I know that this question about the value chain, that is part of your presentation that we will listen to in just a moment. But first, Mark Watts, you will give the first pitch when it comes to partnerships. Please.
Right. Thank you, Connie. I'm really glad to be. I was intending to come to this session to watch and listen, so it's a bit unexpected to be here on the platform, but delighted to be so. As Connie said, I'm the executive director of C40, and this session is all about partnerships. C40 is it's kind of one big partnership, a partnership between the biggest cities in the world. We focus on cities in the context of climate change, hopefully for reasons you're very familiar with. Whilst our cities occupy just 2% of the world's landmass, they consume 75% of the world's energy and produce an equivalent amount of carbon emissions. But also, these are the big productive parts of our global economy, 80% of the world's GDP generated in cities. This is the C40 network, so we're a network of nearly 100 cities. 100 is sort of our limit. The total number changes because we have leadership standards that cities have to meet to demonstrate that they've got Paris Agreement aligned 1.5 degree climate action plans, and they're delivering it. And if they're not meeting those standards, then they lose their membership. So it goes up and down a little bit, and we invite in some fresh blood into that network. It's Only 100 cities, but they're really big cities, substantial cities, so representing directly over 580 million people. If you include the broader metropolitan area that they have significant influence over, it's nearly 900 million people. And our whole reason for being in C40 is the principle that partnership, that collaboration is what's going to allow us to overcome the climate crisis and build a more thriving, a more prosperous, a fairer world in the process. So in simple terms, what we try and do in C40 is take an idea that's got roots, that's really working, delivering lower emissions, halving emissions this decade across our cities whilst improving equity within our cities. If that's working in one place, we try and find the other cities where it could be adopted, replicated, improved upon, and then shared all around the world. We think that's working. One statistic that shows that it is, that the cities are the doers, certainly within the government world, is that 75% of the member cities in C40 are cutting emissions faster than their respective nation states. And actually most of the ones that are not, the 25%, it's only because they cut emissions so fast in the previous decade that now they can't keep going at the pace that they previously were. So we've got mayors in C40 cities committed to using a very inclusive, science-based, truly collaborative, partnership-based approach to help keep the world below 1.5 degrees and build those healthy, equitable and resilient communities in the process. This is a session about partnership. It's about the positive, it's about the working together, but I think we do need to note that if cities here in my thesis, and I'm sure Jim is going to point to the role that the business community plays in being the doers also, there are some delayers out there, and there's some people who are really trying to obstruct our progress in overcoming climate breakdown. And so we have to, at the same time as building positive momentum, we have to push back against that negative momentum. And we're really feeling this in the city space at the moment. And in fact, it's leading us to new forms of partnership, particularly where, for example, we see a fossil fuel industry that's determined that what all the science, the International Energy Agency says is necessary, no new investment in fossil fuels, to carry on ploughing further money into burning substances that we can't afford, that are killing us all. Seeing when city governments now pass regulations that, for example, say you can no longer install gas boilers in new buildings because instead renewable energy is cheaper and cleaner. We now see a big pushback, a lobbying exercise to try and overturn that kind of regulation. And we're needing to work with local communities, needing to work with civil society, needing to work with progressive businesses to push back against that and allow that strong positive regulation to stay in place. And indeed, one example of that in my home city, right now, the Mayor of London is in a courtroom in his city defending the introduction of an expansion of the low emission zone, a really tough, the toughest vehicle emission regulations of any city in the world, expanding those from the inner part of the city to the whole of Greater London so that everybody in London has the opportunity to breathe clean air. But that legislation, that regulation is being challenged in the courts, and so he's needing to defend the right to introduce those measures on behalf of Londoners. So when we look at our overall approach across C40, it's kind of roughly divided into two broad missions for the next few years. The first is to really help the world get off fossil fuels in order to halt climate breakdown. So halving the use, the burning of fossil fuels in C40 cities in the remaining 6 years of this decade. And we think it's important to state that rather than simply saying halving emissions, just to recognise that all of the tremendous progress that we're making in investment in renewable energy and energy efficiency at the moment still is for naught. Globally, greenhouse gas emissions are still rising because last year alone, $1 trillion invested in exploiting new fossil fuel resources. So our first mission is use the demand side powers of cities to stop the demand, stop the need, stop any profit-making opportunity from that investment in fossil fuels, for example, by regulation to have only electric or clean vehicles in cities, to stop the installation of gas and oil-powered heating systems in buildings. Secondly, addressing the impacts and injustice of climate breakdown, which clearly already having massive impacts, but in the process of overcoming those impacts, we also have huge opportunity. Our calculation is to deliver that halving of emissions across C40 cities this decade, it will need to create 50 million good new green jobs across just the 100 C40 cities. Huge opportunity for people living in those cities to have high quality, well-paid jobs that give people the kind of motivation to go into work every day because they know that they're helping build a more prosperous, thriving, fairer future for their cities. But also unlocking the funding for climate resilience that at the moment is woefully lacking and inadequate, particularly for cities who are feeling the largest impacts in the global south. And then thirdly, a theme that's been a big part, certainly of my experience at this conference so far this week, really making climate a health issue, showing the synergies between the measures that we take today to improve air quality, for example, to improve diets, so that people's immediate health benefits that also have big impacts, very synergistic with what we need to do to tackle climate change. So I think, given we're at a conference of architects, a conference with a big focus on urban planning, it's also a place where we start a lot of our work. Firstly, noting the negative, that past city planning, past and indeed current construction practices are in fact fundamentally misaligned with cities' visions of resilient, circular, equitable, low-carbon communities. Most of our cities have been designed, at least in the last 50 to 70 years, for a car-based economy with little thought about the pollution that would cause, the disruption that would cause, the lack of inclusion that would result from that if you don't have access to a motor vehicle. I'm really pleased to say that you can really see now a tipping point, a real change away from that kind of urban planning. We've just been in a session, some of you might have been in it with C40, where just coming out of the pandemic alone, you can see now right across the world, almost every city in C40 has adopted something like the 15-minute city vision of urban planning. The idea that everybody in their local community should be able to access all the services, all the things that you need and make life great within a 15-minute walk or cycle or easy public transport trip from their home, rather than everything being designed on people living in the suburbs and having to move into the centre expensively and pollutingly by transport. Amazing examples of that transformation right across the world, but certainly Paris, which has kind of really adopted that 15-minute standard, the first, partly through the tremendous work of Mayor Hidalgo and Professor Carlos Moreno. Here, pedestrianising streets, particularly around schools, really seeing schools as not just places where children can benefit from learning, but hubs that the whole community can benefit from. And so if you transform the areas around schools into places that people could easily walk and cycle to, that there's public transport aspect, that it's green, that the air is clean, then the whole of the community benefits from that. Or at a very different scale, that's kind of transforming lots of neighborhoods, small pockets of a big city, bit by bit. Wuhan in China has probably the biggest urban resilience project I've ever seen. 100 kilometers of roads being transformed into nature-based greenways as part of the city's drive to cope with rising risk from flooding, but also transforming what was very polluted air into much cleaner air, as the coal power stations are also closed down, as an incredibly rapid vehicle electrification in Wuhan and right across China, but with a massive investment in biodiversity and a big investment in water in the future of that city. And then as a final example, shifting to Latin America, to Bogota, a network there as part of their 15-minute city approach, which they call care blocks. So here, allowing caregivers, both professional and non-professional, to be available to everyone who needs it, for people to easily be able to access care services, essential equipment in child-friendly public spaces, all within a short walking distance of home. So bringing equity into what had been a very divided health service. And a corollary of that, of course, is taking out traffic from roads, making it easier to walk and cycle, and a big expansion of their bus services, including what I think is now not only one of the only fully electric bus routes in the world, but where all of the drivers are female, an entirely women-run bus network in Bogota. So I take from all of that, there's real positive momentum for change. Everything I've talked about in the context of C40 there has come about because of partnership between those cities. Not one of those ideas was developed in isolation in one place through the genius of one mayor or one incredible official. They're all things that groups of cities have worked together with their private sector, with their communities, and with each other across the world. And that, for me, is our biggest message of hope, biggest opportunity for change in overcoming the climate crisis, this global scale collaboration that starts locally but builds out to the whole of the world. And very much looking forward to discussing that in some more detail in a moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark Watts. Thank you. And now from Jim Hagemann Snabe, we will hear the business perspective, or a business perspective. Please.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. I must say I am thrilled about your initiative, and not least what it does to the world at speed and scale. Now, I'll take you somewhere else, as you can see on the picture. Because when I was 2 years old, I moved to Greenland with my parents and my sister. And I can assure you it was a rather special place to grow up as a child. I remember Greenland as cold and dark, yet very beautiful. And it was, I have to admit, a great playground for a boy like me who loves lots of snow. 7 years in Greenland taught me to respect the forces of nature. Now, 50 years later, in April last year, 2022, I returned to join an expedition in northeast Greenland with 13 dogs, a dog sled, and a tent. This time, I didn't stay for 7 years, I stayed for 7 days only. But enough to understand how much nature had changed in those 50 years. Normally, the temperature in northeast Greenland in April is around minus 20 degrees Celsius. And as you can see on this picture, we had a few days where the temperature was above the freezing point. So I went home and I began to study the internet, how much sea levels would rise if Greenland's inland ice would melt. I knew it would be pretty bad, but honestly, I didn't know it would be that bad. 6 to 7 meters globally. I know now, and knowing is important because when we know, we can do something. But between knowing and doing, there is choosing. Knowing is the easy part nowadays because we do have the facts and we do know where the problems are. It's been discussed already at this conference. We built most of our value chains based on fossil energy systems, and they, of course, need to be renewable energy systems, but I don't think it's enough to just reinvent our energy systems to be sustainable. We also need to reinvent the demand side of this equation, and as you can see on this statistic, manufacturing seems to be one of the biggest sinners. But in fact, urban living is an even bigger sinner, or at least emitter of CO2 emissions, as already discussed, in particular when you combine the construction of cities and the operation of buildings. These are all known facts. So what's the problem? Well, not the knowing, but the choosing and doing. The issue is that CO2 emissions are still climbing. So the question is, what are we choosing and what are we doing at speed and scale? When it comes to choosing, I think that we need to be much much more courageous. Our choices need to be made based on what is necessary, not just what is logically possible. When we choose to pursue big dreams, we inspire people to imagine a better future, and the impossible becomes possible. Like we did at A.P. Møller-Mærsk in 2018, when we committed to zero carbon shipping without having any clue about how to do that. I can assure you that was a scary moment in a boardroom where you normally have business cases and well-defined plans on how to do this. That courageous decision sparked an innovation process to solve a problem that seemed unsolvable. The original commitment that we made that day in 2018 was to have a first vessel sailing zero carbon by 2030, which seemed just around the corner, and then we would embark on replacing the entire fleet of 750 vessels by 2050. Now, only 5 years later, we actually have the first vessel sailing already this year. It will come to Copenhagen in September. That is 7 years ahead of the original impossible plan or commitment that we did in 2018, and we have now moved the deadline from 2050 to 2040 because that now seems to be ambitious. This, ladies and gentlemen, is what happens when we choose with courage instead of logic. Now, when it comes to doing, we also need a much more radical approach. Otherwise, we don't get the speed and scale necessary. For 150 years of industrialization, we have worked to specialize and optimize and maximize so that we deliver the best possible products and services in our part of the value chain. But if we want the kind of change that is necessary, we need to reinvent the entire value chain, end to end, based on zero carbon as the going-in assumption, not just a part of it. For that to work, we need massive collaboration and partnerships, and we need a much more holistic approach. Now, very few people know that I once played the trumpet in a symphony orchestra, and it was a great experience, mostly because my fellow musicians played really well. Now, if you want to change the music of a symphony orchestra, you don't start by changing the tune of the trumpets or the violins. You need a new music sheet for all the players at the same time, and you may even need to add a few new instruments. I believe the same is true if you want to decarbonize our value chains. Instead of optimizing our little piece of it, we need to reimagine the entire value chain end to end, and we need to get all the players around the same table with the same level of ambition so that we can invent and scale the technologies needed. Now, many people talk about deglobalization, and it makes me super concerned because at this time in history, we need more global collaboration than ever before. Otherwise, we can't innovate and scale the technologies for a decarbonized future at the speed and scale we need. Now, Northvolt was created like that. From a blank sheet of paper, the founders imagined a zero-carbon battery based on recycling. In other words, a circular design from scratch. As a consequence, Northvolt is now able to reuse more than 95% of all raw materials to produce the next battery. We need a similar approach when it comes to urban living. Designing a beautiful building is not enough, while very beautiful and aesthetic. We need a circular approach like at Northvolt, where we don't just design or just build or just run the building, but we design for circularity and zero carbon, cradle to cradle. The question is, Who is going to take the holistic role to design for circularity and sustainability? My daughter Katrine graduated as an architect last week, right here in Copenhagen. Her final exam as an architect was the design of a circular, sustainable logistics system. I am super proud to see that she has the courage to play this important role as an architect. And Mark just talked about how cities are playing this role to orchestrate the reinvention of their urban areas to become sustainable and better for living. I recently joined the board of Urban Partners, formerly known as NREP. I joined because Urban Partners has chosen to reinvent the real estate industry. Instead of thinking of real estate in the interest of the investor, Urban Partners have chosen to focus on the users of the building, on the cities that house these buildings, and on the planet on which they stand, and still make it a good investment for the investors. In fact, I would argue a much better investment. At Urban Partners, we don't just invest in buildings and return money to the investors. We invest in innovators of new materials. We invest in scale-up companies that can recycle materials. We invest in designing new types of urban areas, the 15-minute city. We collaborate with cities, C40, architects, startups, construction companies, and investors, so that we can develop urban areas to be better and sustainable. And yes, it can be done. There are plenty of great examples on stage today, out there in the exhibition. We have a lot of the pieces that we need. And I can assure you, as a businessman, this is a great business opportunity. It is not just a philanthropic project. Actually, I believe that this might be the biggest business opportunity in my lifetime. At Northvolt, we have an order book of 50 billion euros for green batteries. And Siemens is having the highest growth rate since 20 years by decarbonizing industrial and urban infrastructures together with our ecosystem. With the launch of Urban Partners as a catalyst for urban development, there seems to be, in my mind, unlimited opportunities in this industry. To me, as a newcomer, I have to accept and admit, this industry actually seems to be the best industry to have this kind of approach. The best industry of all to be reinvented. Not just because it is the biggest emitter of CO2, but also because we can achieve multiple goals at the same time. We can make urban areas more sustainable, we can make urban areas more livable, and we can make urban areas healthier and more human. So why is this not happening at scale? We have the technologies to make this happen. Just look out in the exhibition. What is missing? The answer from my point of view is leadership. Leadership is not about optimizing the current. It is about having courage to imagine the future. I call it dreams and details. Dreams to imagine a better future and get people excited to be part of that journey, like hopefully you are. And details, because we need to orchestrate the needed collaboration around all the critical technologies and details to make this happen at the speed and scale we need. I often say that we are lucky to be leaders in times of such radical change, but with that luck comes an obligation to lead towards a much better future. Let me end with a quote from Bernard Shaw, who said, "Most people see things that are and ask why. I imagine things that aren't and ask why not." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim Hagemann Snabe. Thank you both for good presentations. Really something to discuss. I wondered, Jim, if we could start with you elaborating. It's very clear call for leadership. You have examples, Maersk. It's the biggest shipping company on planet Earth. Northvolt, an enormously growing business. Why? Because now there is this request for batteries for cars, because there were some regulations and some innovations leading to that demand being created, and they were first movers. What would be your advice for a sector like architects? Because yes, there are big offices and bureaus, but still, it's not the Maersks, it's not the Northvolts. So if you want to change that whole value chain, as you are suggesting, who is that we? How to get started changing things in a sector like architecture?
It's a great question. And honestly, if I only had the experience I had up until recently, where I was, leading very large organizations, large organizations have incredible impact. Siemens has 320,000 employees around the world, and we install, the infrastructures of this world. So there's an obvious impact, and therefore my original assumption was you just need to be big enough, then you can make a difference. But then I came to Northvolt, which started from a blank sheet of paper. It didn't exist 8 years ago. It's not that there are not companies at scale making batteries, but this company started with an idea, a design, a thought process around a holistic, end-to-end recycled battery, where you produce the battery with zero carbon. It's quite energy intense, so you need a sustainable energy source. But then you take the batteries back when they're used, you crush them to powder, and you find a way to extract the lithium, the copper, the carbon, and the nickel, and start all over again. When I saw that, I said to Emma, who was the inventor of this, Emma, this is magic. And she looked at me and said, no, Jim, it's chemistry. So what I want to say with that is that I can understand why, as an architect, you feel that this is too big a project to do because you don't have the impact of Siemens. But Northvolt was started by people with the holistic design approach. And if there's anything architects do, it is have the opportunity, the power of the pen, to think about this problem much broader, cradle to cradle. And if you do that, you can be a single architect and have huge impact, maybe more than Siemens. It is actually much easier to start from a blank sheet of paper than to change large organizations.
But you do not control the whole value chain.
That is correct. And my biggest advice is you need to find the customer who is willing to be part of such an approach.
Of developing what is not there already.
Yes. And my argument, and one of the big arguments I have, is that if you have that scope in the way you design things, in the way you think about it, so it becomes a system that you're architecting, not a piece, that business is a better business than the old way. The old way is so full of waste. And therefore, if you can convince someone about your vision, there is a buyer, and when there is a buyer, you de-risk the project. That's how Northvolt started. You don't have an order book of 50 billion euros based on an idea without having buyers who can see the benefit of this circular approach. Because the raw materials that you reuse will eventually be cheaper than the ones you mine, and there's your business case.
Mark Watts, you were basically describing a number of cities, some of your members, Paris, Bogota, others, who did exactly what Jim is suggesting, setting up the dream, having the vision, defining it. But then you also said that practices are misaligned with the visions. How to align better these things? Because policymakers in these big megacities, they have some roles to play. How can they get the whole chain working in the way that Jim describes would make sense?
Well, I think the direction of travel is now very positive, but I think we start from a basis where urban planning was taking us into a very deep hole of cities that really weren't very good for human health and were terrible for the long-term future of humanity by kind of essentially making cities almost a requirement of a city was to produce a huge amount of emissions and generate a huge amount of waste. I think what's really changing that it's somewhat the same answer is it's the confidence that comes from seeing that what you're trying to do in your city is not kind of unique and unusual and difficult, but actually is something that is becoming the norm that can be done in lots of other places. I think it's a really interesting thing I find, having spent my whole life working with politicians. Most political leaders don't want to be the first to do something, because being the first to do something is bloody difficult and scary.
And expensive.
And expensive, and there's almost, you don't get a second chance in politics. So you make a big mistake, you lose your job. Most people would like to go second. And so creating a framework, as we've done in C40 and many other great organisations, where before you start on a big change in policy, you've got the chance to talk with other places and see what they're doing. And there always are going to be pioneers, and seeing that the pioneering city that's done the congestion pricing, that's decided to only allow electric buses onto the streets, and it worked, and it's popular, and you've been able to take people with you, that creates a huge amount of confidence. We've seen incredible shifts in markets in cities in very short space of time, particularly where technology is concerned. It's only a few years ago that I was essentially touring around American and European mayors, just asking them, why is it you've only got 5 or 10 electric buses on your streets when I've just been in Shenzhen and there are 10,000? And they're saying, but my transport officials say electric buses aren't ready to use at scale yet. And I said, go to Shenzhen, have a look what's happening there. And just that opening up of the eyes, and then the competitive urge when you see all of the other cities doing the same, and then suddenly we're getting massive electric bus fleets right across the world.
But of course, electric buses, to take that example, is only interesting if the energy source is green and sustainable. So that's just one example how complex it is also for the local mayor and the local municipality. So would you say, I know that is what C40 is all about, to try to exchange best practices, but how could we do even better there? Because to be honest, often you see a standalone idea there, a standalone idea there, a standalone idea there, and you wonder how come we cannot make it the norm faster.
Sure, I think two answers to that. One, just taking it from the city government perspective, which is what I know best. Most of these big cities, they can influence half or more of the emissions in their city, directly or with a strong indirect. So I don't really pay much attention when someone's saying, the city it hasn't got the power to really deliver on the carbon emission change. And one innovation that we've seen really taking off in the last year or so, started in Oslo and in the Nordics, is the concept of climate budgeting, whereby now 12 other cities in C40 have essentially made it a rule that the city can't pass its annual financial budget unless they can demonstrate that the money that they're spending each year will help deliver the carbon budget. And that takes it out of the siloed project for the electric bus or the green development to every department. Every bit of procurement in the city, 40% of government is procurement, has got to be seen through the lens of how it delivers on the climate programme. But I think the other part of it is actually increasingly what we're seeing in C40, increasingly a big part of our work is the partnerships with the private sector, with the progressive mission-driven businesses that are as committed to try and achieve the climate change, the pushing back of climate change as our member cities are. And so now, if I think about our Green Thriving Neighbourhoods initiative, which is the 15-minute city concept, we're delivering it with Urban Partners, with the company that was formerly NREP in partnership, when we're trying to help our mayors win the arguments for taking fossil fuel power out of buildings through their regulatory powers, and a huge pushback from the gas industry in particular to try and prevent
And
that.
sometimes for the citizens as well. Just look to Germany right now.
Absolutely, and and citizens that believe that they can only be a good cook if they've got gas. They can't be done on an electric stove, because that's the message. But we're working there, here with Velux to try and get the data that shows the benefits of a healthy building, a building that doesn't rely on fossil fuels, that's designed in a way that minimises energy use. The multiple benefits that are going to make that property more desirable, a place where people want to live.
Yeah, that's a good example, Jim, with the co-benefits. Sometimes in our economic system, we are not good enough, I would claim, to factor in the co-benefits, because we sort of still think very much in silos. How can you work with that as business?
I think this is the fundamental problem, and that's what I try to address by this industrialization experience we have for 150 years, where progress was done by specialization. So we got better and better at one thing, and then the next company does the next thing, and then eventually it adds up to a very efficient supply chain. That approach is great for continuous improvement, but it does break the problem down in silos, and each silo is optimized, but totality is not. And so we then, so if you take the urban as an example, so we build these urban areas, we put the jobs in the center, the people outside, then we have traffic. So now we solve the traffic problem, we have, we need roads. Then we have congestion. Then we put limitations to traffic, or we put public transportation, or we put electric vehicles, but we're trying to solving one problem at the other instead of rethinking the city. If you do a 15-minute city, you don't need transportation. You're in walking distance from everything. And so that's where a holistic approach, where you look at it end to end. And who better than those who sit with a pen, if they get permission, if they take permission to do that. So that's what we need. If you just take the electric vehicle as an example, and you do it in buckets, the electric vehicle is bad for the economy in Denmark, because we have very high taxes on normal cars and very little on electric vehicles. So if you look at that bucket goes down. It gets less money the more we buy electric vehicles. Yes, but the healthcare costs go down faster. And so you have to add it all up and look at it. And that's the opportunity you have. Now, why is this happening now? Because the technologies are so advanced that we now can create those redefined cities, or even, transportation systems with zero carbon, and make it a better business. A kilowatt hour from solar and wind is cheaper than one from a coal-fired power plant. So why are we arguing whether I'm still allowed to make a coal-fired power plant? That's stupid, if wind and solar is cheaper. And that's where we need the scale. Now is the moment. We have that inflection point. Now is the moment to redefine the scale of architecture.
But it took us maybe 30, maybe 40 years to get to the point where, for instance, solar and wind were cheaper than coal, and we do not have that much time in order to live up to all the nice targets set, and both the SDGs, but also the climate targets. Are you basically arguing, Jim Hagemann Snabe, that what is needed is also more politics and planning? Because if we have this greater vision, as Mark is also proposing, and that many of the cities are doing, some people in the business community would say, no, let the market do this. What is your take? Do we have to rethink, does the business community have to rethink also the role of policy making and regulation?
I think it's an important point. From my leadership, I always argue that I got to live with whatever is out there and still lead with conviction. But that doesn't mean that the policy side can't do things. There's a huge lever, maybe the biggest lever of all the levers, that will dramatically accelerate us to a carbon neutral future. If policymakers would put a price on CO2 of $150 per metric ton, the business world would dramatically accelerate getting rid of carbon, because it's too expensive to emit CO2. And so you basically need to have the business model of business to work in favor of the progress of this planet. We're getting there now because the prices of the technologies are getting there, but if you really want to accelerate this, You just put a price on carbon from a policy side. You don't even have to have a master plan. Actually, I don't think you can do this from a master plan. But you need to bring companies around the same table from various sectors. When Maersk did the decarbonizing of shipping, we opened a center for zero carbon shipping in Copenhagen. And we invited all companies and policymakers to join the table. Very few shipping companies are around the table. These are chemical companies and energy companies and engineering companies and policymakers. It's not shipping companies. The shipping industry is not solving the problem. They're facilitating, they're orchestrating the solution. Like C40 is orchestrating the solution and the learning of best practices across cities. And it's almost like we forgot the conductor of the symphony orchestra. We're all playing our instruments. And somebody needs to take over the conductor role. I'm arguing architects have a huge role to play.
But Mark, the problem is the world does not have the big conductor there at the global stage, and then we can agree on all sorts of things, including the pricing. So some regions, some cities will work with pricing directly or shadow pricing. Is there something where the relationship between the cities and the states also could be elaborated a bit more there? Because I know a lot of your members are quite frustrated with what happens at the state level. And what they will listen to in their daily lives would be incumbents saying, oh, don't do that. Save us for that. Our competitors in this or that city or this and that country or market will not have the same conditions. We need to continue business as usual. How to overcome that obstacle?
Well, I do think, just following on from your question to Jim, I don't think there's any way out of this climate crisis without a big role for planning or a mission-led approach. One of the biggest problems of the neoliberal era has been the idea that it's a problem when government tries to create and shape markets, and the role of government should just be to step in when there's been a market failure. It's not served us well, and it absolutely won't get us out of the climate crisis. We need just as much entrepreneurship in government as we do in the business sector. We need entrepreneurial governments who are seeing their role to set that direction based on the science that shows us what we need to do to overcome the climate crisis, and not be afraid to set regulation, legislation, to invest, to create markets as much as shape the ones that already are, so that the firms, the companies that can help us deliver this incredibly fast, big reduction in emissions that we need are the ones that prosper, and the ones that are trying to delay and hold us back are the ones that fail and go out of business. And I think it needs to be that clear and decisive. I think the relationship between the city and the national governments, what we're seeing at a city level is an ability and a willingness to collaborate across politics, across geography, across cultures, right around the world around a common problem, which is the climate crisis. Unfortunately, as you know much better than me, we're still not seeing that happen at an intergovernmental level at anything like the way that we need. I think, therefore, we should see an empowerment at the local government level from the national. Let them take the strain, let them take more of the leadership as they're willing to do it. But also, particularly coming into COP this year, we're locked in lots of discussions with the UN and with lots of nation states about let's just, when we look at those national contributions, those national commitments, let's recognize and look at what the local governments, what the cities within your country are already committing to, and ask them what they need, along with the businesses in those countries. What do they need to be able to deliver the target? And for national governments to, at the very least, devolve those powers and create the regulations that will help them achieve that target and push the national.
But just very briefly, wrapping up this part, Jim, when we talk about ESG, for instance, pricing, look what is happening in the US with the discussion on this. Extremely polarized. Many of these different states coming back to saying, sort of like Milton Friedman, business is the purpose of business is business, or whatever he said, saying we do not want to have anything of this. So it starts also, you both sound so hopeful, but there also starts to be sort of a backtracking also in some parts of the business community on some of these demands.
Yeah, no, it is concerning to see some of that. I tend to believe it's mostly politicians out to get some votes. and not business leaders. The roundtable in the US signed a multi-stakeholder commitment 2 years ago or 3 years ago. At World Economic Forum, business leaders of the largest companies in this world are marching ahead. And as I said earlier, we're at the inflection point where it's just a better business. To make a green battery is a better business than to make it not green. To make green energy systems is a better business than not, etc., etc. So I think it's domestic policy arguments to win elections, not the voice of businesses. If I look at the investors, this has been the issue so far. The investors are now moving their money as well. You look at NREP as a good example of that. Huge demand. In a time where you basically can't fundraising for urban partners for this kind of projects is absolutely possible. Maybe one remark to this policy, because we have policy on global level. I think global institutions have, to some extent, failed. We have country levels, and then we have cities. Why am I so excited about the city? I actually believe that a mayor has more influence on progress than any state leader in most countries, because they are close to where the action is. They can make the policies within the frameworks that exist. They can be ambitious, and mostly they can make it happen, not just talk about it.
And that's right, Mark. The mayor, the local politicians will be close to where people live their life, where the small businesses are thriving or not. But they are also those closest when change comes with some kind of price. I saw that among your members there, it's at Dhaka, Chennai, cities where you just grow like this, you need buildings like this, you need housing like that. How to make this transition without pushing even more polarization forward? That's one of the themes that we have heard time and again up here on stage.
And I think there's some very basic things there. We have an inclusive climate action program that's most working with cities with that kind of rapid change, where actually the most important thing is to start the conversation with communities early, before that rapid development happens, because the thing that most polarizes, that most provokes opposition, is a feeling for people that stuff is being done to them without their permission. It's the easiest thing for the conspiracy theorists, for the alt-right, for the fossil fuel lobby to get behind and build opposition. And so the more that government, and you're right, city government is closer, or is better able, but I think often it requires an ability to see those who may have been your opponents yesterday to be your friends tomorrow. So we particularly work with trade unions in cities. We often work with some of the most vociferous campaigning groups in our member cities at the behest of our mayors and our mayor cities. But one day those campaigners are campaigning against the mayor for the project they don't like. The next day, though, they're working together to support the low emission zone, to support the new housing regulation. And there's nothing better than starting local if you want to do things fast and do things big.
No, but in democracies, one thing is to say it's getting better and it will be cheap in the long run, but your mayors, they are going to be elected in the very short run. So how to cope with that transition? I mean, it's fine to say we want to go there, but how to get there if some of the means that get you to where you want to be is slightly more expensive to start with, and you are there as a mayor and you want to build fast. It's now, because you have to deliver also on that front.
Well, first of all, make sure that the right people pay. We should be employing the polluter pays principle. Think something I spent a lot of my early career on bringing in the congestion charge in London. When we started bringing that policy to charge people to drive into the centre of London, we went out and talked to mayors all around the world. They laughed at us. They said, you can't do this and get re-elected in the city. But the fundamental principle in the congestion charge was basically the rich people paid for it, because it was only people who were already pretty wealthy that could afford to drive their car into central London and park it anyway. And it was a minority. The majority of Londoners benefited from the revenue that came in from that congestion charge that allowed us to expand the bus service, reduce the fares, increase the cycle lanes. The reduction in pollution benefited everybody. So designing policies that benefit the majority, and where the minority who do have to pay are the ones who can bear it, who are able to pay it, or deserve to pay it because they're the ones causing the pollution.
So I just wonder here, towards the end here, you have a group of architects here. I guess there will also be a number of city planners here in the room, and the title here is Partnerships. And you have both sort of touched upon it. But would you have any good advice to a group like this? Because my sense is there are so many interesting projects out there. There is a strong will. There's also the knowing, as Jim was saying. But while you see all these interesting sustainable projects being built, you also see a lot of business as usual out there. What is the biggest hurdle, Jim, to overcome if we are going to see scale as we need it within a very foreseeable future?
So there are many hurdles, of course. I would maybe focus on two if we focus the conversation around the urban challenge. Number one, even if we were to build all buildings on this planet from now on until 2040 to be carbon neutral, we would still have 80% of the emissions because we have all the existing buildings. So there's a huge need to reimagine existing buildings and make them better and more livable, and environments. We can't tear them all down and build new ones. We had the same problem at Maersk when we designed a vessel to be carbon neutral. We actually thought about how do we retrofit that technology into the existing vessels. And suddenly you don't have to build 750 new vessels, and that's the reason why we could move the deadline from 2050 to 2040. We can retrofit. And there's a huge demand for that, and somehow that has to be part of the architectural discipline. And the second point of view is the mindset.
So that has to be as prestigious also.
It's almost more important than the new fancy building, because as I said, it's easy to start with a clean sheet of paper. It's much harder to change something that exists already. And the second point of view I have on this is a mindset change. We have a mindset that all of this green stuff is expensive. What if it's not expensive, but much better from a business point of view? And the mindset that an architect designs a house, maybe even a house for its lifetime, is just not a broad enough mindset. I think there, if I could wish for one thing, I saw it with my daughter. She was studying architecture. She just graduated, as I said, and she said to me when she was getting into this, said, I don't want to sit and design the details of a window. I want to create circular systems. And it's almost like that scope, to have that in mind. If you have the skill to design, imagine the impact you can have. If you broaden the scope end to end, cradle to cradle, then the impact is enormous. Nobody is taking this really well. Few are. Cities are. Urban partners are. If architects do this, it's like you have permission to do this. We try and do it because we have to, but you have permission.
Okay. And Mark Watts, any good advice, any good ask for people here?
Well, I think maybe an ask is, I spend lots of time with architects, with engineers, with real estate developers. I know hardly any who want to build a business as usual building or development, a high carbon building, and yet so many do. And I think that to get the sense of the strength of the collective here, it's not good enough just to believe in something. You've actually got to go out and deliver it as well. And it's not good enough to be an individual practice that's committed to delivering a low-carbon, thriving future, but to be part of a trade association that's trying to block progressive regulation and legislation that would enable that. I think if just the community really properly got together, worked with their legislators, worked with their city and national legislators to really get behind the politicians when they're doing the right thing, or push them to go further than they're willing to go at the moment, to bring in the regulations that allows you to deliver the kind of projects that you want. We absolutely have got the power to completely rapidly change those markets. But I think there's another bit which is just making everybody feel involved in that. I love your slide, Jim, on the President Kennedy and the moon landing mission. I love that story, and that when President Kennedy visited Mission Control in Houston, and he was walking down a corridor late at night, and he bumped into the janitor, the caretaker. And President Kennedy said to him, "Oh, what do you do here? What's your job?" And the guy just looked at him and said, "I'm helping put a man on the moon." And I think that sense when everybody involved right throughout an organization feels part of the mission is when you really get change. And let's make sure in all of our organizations that's true.
So very clear messages from up here. Work with the planners and the policymakers. Say no to business as usual. And I hear that maybe there's also the need to think and reflect about whether a mindset change is needed, and on the political side to take care that co-benefits are factored in, and externalities, the way we think our economic system and public procurement. There's a lot to do for you. I think we owe our two panelists here a round of applause. Thank you very much, Jim Hagemann Snabe and Mark Watts.